Welcome to an all-new video from the Ancient and Medieval Adventures camps. As a part of our exploration into the different kinds of magical creatures, this video will teach you all about fairies. You've probably heard about fairies before, but today we will be diving into their origins and Celtic stories and beliefs. We will learn which cultures and places fairy stories came from, look at what fairies are and where they live, find out how to see fairies and their magic, and finally, look at how fairy lore continues to be told through books, TV, and movies today. The fairy faith, or the belief in fairies, began as a belief of a group of people called the Celts. The Celts were a people made up of a number of different groups who settled in various regions of Western Europe, which we now call Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, and parts of Britain. Some of the earliest stories featuring fairies come from the Ulster Cycle, a series of Irish mythological tales that take place in the ancient past over 2,000 years ago. So what are fairies according to Celtic belief? Fairies are a group of magical, immortal creatures that are connected very closely to the natural world. Fairies have a powerful magic that they use to stay invisible most of the time, but will sometimes let themselves be seen by humans. Their magic is said to be able to help them control the weather, see the future, and cast powerful illusions called glamours. Because they are so powerful and because they can curse humans when they are angry, fairies are called by many respectful nicknames in Celtic traditions. Although we know them as fairies or fae, folklore often refers to them as the good folk, the fair folk, or the good neighbors as a sign of respect. In Ireland, one of the names for the fairies is called Shay folk, or people of the mounds, because of the fairy mounds called Shay in which the fairies were thought to spend time. Despite this name, fairies do not actually live in our world. Celtic belief says that they live in another world that connects to ours. This place is usually called fairyland, or just fairy. According to stories, fairy is a beautiful place filled with strange fruits, plants, and people. But the strangest thing about it is that time works very differently there. An Irish farmer interviewed about people who had traveled to fairy told the following story. People who would be 20 years in fairyland, and it would seem to them no more than a night. A bridegroom who was taken by the fairies on his wedding day was in fairyland for many generations, and upon coming back thought that it was just the next morning. He asked where all the wedding guests were, but only found one old woman who remembered the wedding. Fairies will often cross over into the human world, but humans can also cross into fairyland. Celtic stories say that you can find the doorway to fairyland by stepping into a mushroom ring, lifting up a patch of oddly colored grass, or by following the strange lights or music into the forest at night. However, humans who travel into fairyland must be careful. Folk belief states that if humans eat the food in fairyland, they will never be able to return home. Although all fairies come from the same land, there are many different kinds of fairies. Some well-known examples of fairies include elves. In most stories, elves like these belong to a royal court of fairies known as the gentry, who are the most powerful and beautiful of all the fairies. There are also solitary fairies, or fairies that live in the world and who are not a part of the courts. The Fuca is a solitary fairy who can shapeshift into different animals and who will often share secrets with travelers who meet him. Even though he looks very different from what we would recognize today, this is an example of a leprechaun, a trickster fairy who hides pots of gold at the end of rainbows. Other kinds of fairies include dwarves, pixies, mermaids, trolls, and more. When fairies leave their home in fairyland to visit the human world, they love to play games with and play tricks on humans. Many fairies spend their time telling riddles and are known to have riddle contests with the humans that they meet. Here are a couple riddles that you can try out. Can you solve them? Pause the video here and try and guess the answers. Were you able to guess the answers to the riddles? The first answer is fire, which will die without being fed wood and that burns to the touch. The second riddle's answer is your shadow, which follows you around on the ground but can hardly be seen at noon when the sun is high. Fairies love to trick people with word games like these, where the answers are often very simple but can be difficult to figure out. Of course, fairy tricks are not always as harmless as riddle contests. Celtic fairies are very powerful and sometimes will bless humans with gifts, like fairy godmothers in Sleeping Beauty. But fairies can play other tricks that range from annoying to dangerous. Minor tricks can include tangling hair or spoiling milk. Many stories tell of fairies stealing children and adults away to fairyland, leaving behind dolls or bundles of sticks that are enchanted to look like humans. And when fairies get mad, they can use their magic to curse humans. Fortunately, Celtic belief can also tell us how to see through fairy tricks to help people stay safe when the fairy tricks have gone too far. Some methods, like carrying salt and plants like St. John's wort in your pocket or turning a piece of clothing inside out, are used to see through fairy illusions to avoid getting tricked by their glamour. It is well known in Celtic belief that fairies have a weakness to iron, so iron can be used to protect from fairies or to keep you from getting enchanted. Fairies are said to stay away from cities where there is too much metal. The very best way to avoid being tricked by fairies, however, is to have the second sight. The second sight is something that people can be born with, allowing them to see fairies even when they are invisible, and making them immune to fairy magic. However, according to folklore, the sight can also be gained by looking through a hagstone or a stone with a hole in the center. Potions made of special herbs can also get rid of fairy magic and give people the sight. Although a lot of fairy folklore comes from old Celtic stories, these tales are told in many different ways in modern culture. The Cornish pixies, mermaids, and griffins in Harry Potter are examples of fairies in modern British stories. English stories from the past, like Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, talk about the fairy courts and the tricks that they play on humans. Fairies are especially present in fairy tales and have made their way into Disney adaptations of these stories, like the dwarves in Snow White and the fairies in Sleeping Beauty. The superstitions, traditions, and stories that began in old Celtic tribes have turned out to be almost as immortal as the fairies themselves. Thank you for watching this presentation. Now that you've learned more about fairies, see if you can discover signs of them in your backyard with our fairy scavenger hunt checklist. Then make your own fairy circle with the fairy ring craft video right here on WordPress. Have we piqued your interest in Celtic fairy lore? The Spiderwick Chronicles is a great book series to help you explore more about who fairies are and what they do.